In the Rules of War, Article 22 states that aerial bombardment for the purpose of terrorizing the civilian population, of destroying or damaging private property, not its military character, or of injuring non-combatants is prohibited. Not all the actions taken by the Allies were effective, let alone legal. Both Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the U.S., attacked cities and countries instead of militaries, resulting in a total of 50 to 70 million killed. Churchill firebombed the cities in Germany and Italy. He stated in a radio speech in Room 60, "We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender." Only some of the firebombing was effective. 1 in 5 planes landed 75 square miles from its assigned target. Roosevelt was responsible for the creation of the atomic bombs that were later dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Only the first bomb was truly effective because of the lives that would have been lost by soldiers was more that died from the bomb. The atomic bombs were necessary for the Japanese surrender. World War II was a brutal war because of the crimes done by Churchill and Roosevelt to cause the actual defeat. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill are both guilty of breaking laws, thus making them war criminals during World War II. Although both did break laws, it is believed that the actions that were taken were necessary for the survival of their relative countries, as well as the defeat of German and Japanese forces.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, also known as FDR, was the 32nd President of the United States, leading us during a time of an economic crisis and World War II. Despite the fact that he was the only president elected for more than 2 terms and known as one of the top 3 United States presidents, he was a war criminal. Before he served as president, he was the New York Senate Assistant, Secretary of Navy, and Governor of New York. FDR was inaugurated on March 4, 1933. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack was intended to prevent the U.S. Pacific Fleet from obstructing military actions. The Japanese Empire was plotting against the United Kingdom, Netherlands, and the United States. This attack shocked the United States and left FDR with no choice but to enter World War II. FDR announced December 7, 1941 as a date which will live in infamy. The attack on Pearl Harbor also led Americans to question the loyalty of Japanese Americans. FDR authorized internment with Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. This allowed local military commanders to designate military areas as exclusion zones from which any or all persons may be excluded due to racial suspicion. In 1942, approximately 110,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans, some of which were only 1/16 Japanese, were interned, as well as 1,200 to 1,800 Japanese Americans residing in Hawaii, where 1/2 of their population were of Japanese ethnicity. Out of all who were interned, 62% of them were American citizens. FDR literally put his own people into internment camps. Life in the internment camps was harsh. Families were often separated and only allowed to bring a few possessions, not to mention the emotional hardship they had to cope with. Some died from lack of proper medicine and unbearable emotional stress. Article 23 in the Rules of War states that it is prohibited to employ arms, projectiles, or material calculated to cause unnecessary suffering, thus proving such conditions of internment camps to be war crimes and making FDR a war criminal for allowing it to happen. In 1938, prior to FDR's knowledge of atomic bombs, a statement was given to the League of Nations Assembly that the international bombing population is illegal. In 1939, Albert Einstein wrote to FDR declaring that he and several other scientists were aware of the Nazi Germany effort to purify uranium-235, which could be used to build an atomic bomb. Soon after, the U.S. government started the Manhattan Project, which is the assembly of the atomic bomb. From 1935 to 1945, roughly $2 billion and over 130,000 people contributed to the development of the first atomic bomb. FDR said that if the atomic bombs were ready before the war with Germany ended, he should be ready to drop them on Germany. The United States used the atomic bomb as a threat to Germany. FDR was well aware of the fatal effects the atomic bombs could have on civilians. Although FDR died in 1945, before Germany surrendered, Harry S. Truman, former vice president, did in fact use the atomic bombs against Japan. If it were not for FDR, Truman would not have been able to use the atomic bombs, therefore FDR is held responsible, making him a war criminal. Winston Churchill's involvement in World War II began on September 3, 1939, the day Britain declared war on Germany. On that day, Churchill was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty. At this point, the war was called the Phony War because the only noticeable action was at sea. During the Phony War, Churchill held the desire to acquire Norway, which was a neutral country, as well as Sweden. Churchill advocated to occupy the Norwegian iron ore port of Narvik and several iron mines in Sweden early in the war. Despite Churchill's desperation to seize control of these areas, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, and the rest of the British War Cabinet disagreed with Churchill, saying that his plan was unnecessary and that attacking a neutral country would be unjust. On May 10, 1940, Prime Minister Chamberlain resigned and Churchill quickly filled his empty position. Although the vast majority of Britain wanted to find a peaceful resolution to the rising threat of Adolf Hitler and the German army, Churchill refused to negotiate and prepared Britain for a long war. Throughout World War II, Winston Churchill committed and planned many war crimes. For example, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the American president at the time, and Churchill created a plan called the Morgenthau Plan, which would have killed tens of millions of Germans. This plan was a lot like Adolf Hitler's plan for the Soviet Union had the Germans defeated the Soviet army. Churchill even brainstormed dropping tens of thousands of anthrax super bombs on the civilian population of Germany and ordered detailed planning for a chemical attack on 6 major cities. If this plan had been executed, millions would have died immediately upon the breathing in of the chemicals. But Churchill's greatest war crimes involved the terror bombing of the German cities that killed 600,000 civilians and left some 800,000 injured. Churchill lied to the House of Commons and the people of Britain, claiming that only military and industrial installations were targeted. In reality, the aim was to kill as many civilians as possible. The use of carpet bombing in an attempt to terrorize the Germans into surrendering. According to the official history of the Royal Air Force, the destruction of Germany was by then on a scale in which might have appalled Attila or Genghis Khan. One of the most horrifying bombings was the aerial attack on the German city of Dresden. Dresden was filled with masses of helpless refugees running for their lives ahead of the advancing Red Army. The war was practically over, but for 3 days and nights, from February 13th to 15th, 1945, British bombs pounded Dresden, killing as many as 135,000 people or more in 3 days. After the massacre, Churchill attempted to disclaim responsibility, even casually saying, "I thought the Americans did it." The terror bombing of Germany and the killing of civilians continued as late as the middle of April 1945. It only stopped, as bombers Harris noted, because there were essentially no more targets left to be bombed in Germany.
Bombing of non-military sites was new as in World War II. As an effect of having its cities and industrial factories bombed by the Luftwaffe, commonly known as the German Air Force, Britain's bombing plan against Germany became more aggressive and they too began targeting civilian cities and industrial factories. The British Royal Air Force were dropping bombs that ended up landing 75 to 150 miles away from their intended targets. The accuracy of the bombs that were dropped was at 7% at this point in the war. Many of the pilots dropped their bombs at an estimated position and hoped for the best. When a bomb hit within its 100 square foot target range, the damage was extensive. Whole towns could be wiped out by one single bomb. Upon hitting the ground, British incendiary bombs exploded and set fire to everything around it, including the air. The towns that were hit with these bombs were demolished and the people suffocated or burned to death. This may seem harsh, but it ultimately led to German defeat. In a post-war analysis, 91% of German civilians voted that the British bombing was the toughest of hardships throughout the war and was also the biggest reason for the huge drop in morale. Also, in 1944, before the end of the war, 75% of all German civilians said that they believed the war was already lost due to the intensity of the bombing. It may seem drastic to bomb innocent civilians who happen to reside in a country that is the enemy, but clearly it was effective and thorough. While Winston Churchill's acts may have seemed excessive, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States during World War II, was even more aggressive. He said that if Germany didn't surrender, he would drop the atomic bombs on them. Harry S. Truman took office after FDR died on April 12th of 1945. Prior to becoming president, Truman had no knowledge that atomic bombs existed, let alone that the United States was in possession of two. Roosevelt's original plan was to threaten Germany with the atomic bombs until they agreed to surrender, or to drop them if they refused. By mid-May 1945, all German forces had surrendered. The Soviet Union was beginning to make an advance into Japan in order to set up a communist part of the country. The United States had still not fully retaliated for Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, so President Truman saw this as an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. He decided that if he dropped an atomic bomb in Japan and stopped the Soviets from advancing, that it would be better in the long run. The Japanese openly said that they would not surrender until all of Japan was gone or they had won. After the dropping of the first atomic bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, on Hiroshima, the Japanese people were weakened and brought down drastically. 2 days later, Truman sent for the second bomb to be dropped. Dropping of the second bomb is seen by many as excessive and cruel, although it did send the Soviets back into Russia and caused Japan to surrender. The dropping of the first atomic bomb in Japan most likely saved Japanese lives, simply because they would have continued to fight a much larger, stronger army until they all died. The second one is often seen as an extreme power statement used to show the United States' control and superiority over everyone else.
World War II was the only war with nuclear weapons. Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt took part in war crime. However, the actions taken were necessary in order to stop Germany from furthering their advance on Western Europe. Also, the atomic bombs caused the surrender of Japan. However, both Churchill and Roosevelt broke laws and killed civilians to win the war. They invaded German, Italian, and Japanese cities with weapons of mass destruction. Although their actions seemed harsh and cruel, they greatly helped ensure the victory for the Allies and bring an efficient end to World War II.